The Chinese government is getting intensely personal about its citizens' sex lives. Officials are calling up young women to ask why they aren't pregnant. They're even taxing condoms and birth control to force couples into having unprotected sex. This sudden panic traces straight to the top. Xi Jinping has flatly told his officials that increasing childbirth rates is a matter of national survival. You might think, so what if their population shrinks a little? Even if it cuts in half over the next few decades, China would still be massive. They'd still outnumber almost everyone else on Earth. Focusing on the total population count overlooks the structural flaw hiding deeper in the demographics, a mathematical imbalance that threatens to halt the Chinese century before it can truly begin. Population scientists use the dependency ratio. How many working-age adults are there compared to the kids and retirees they must support? Right now, China sits at a healthy ratio of 45 dependents for every 100 workers. When that ratio is low, a country has tens of millions of extra workers generating excess wealth. That surplus productivity goes straight into the economy, funding the megacities, the aircraft carriers, and the global supply chains that define modern China. While trade policy and technology built the infrastructure of this rise, the dependency ratio provided the surplus labor and capital to pay for it all. If that ratio tips, the primary source of that national funding disappears. Every developed nation eventually faces a drop in birth rates. This scatterplot chart shows the correlation. As a country moves to the right, growing wealthier and offering higher education, it tracks downward as citizens have fewer children. Here is China's trajectory. Their birth rate dropped half a century earlier than economic models suggest. They hit the low birth rates of a rich Western nation long before they built the advanced economy needed to support an aging society. To understand why, we have to look back to the 1970s. Following the devastating famines of the Great Leap Forward, China experienced a massive baby boom, with families suddenly having 6 or 7 kids. Chinese leadership, composed largely of engineers and missile scientists rather than sociologists, panicked. They projected a population of 4.5 billion and mass starvation. So they applied a cold mathematical formula to a complex biological reality. They banned families from having more than one child. The state sent out shock brigades to strictly police the wombs of hundreds of millions of women across the country. The enforcement of this policy was notoriously brutal. Government officials coerced over 300 million women into forced abortions and sterilized tens of millions more, often rounding them up by force. Now, 30 years later, the math of that policy is coming due. The generation born during this era is locked into a 4-2-1 family structure: 4 grandparents, 2 parents, and a single child. Those only children are now reaching their 30s. Very soon, a single worker and their partner will have to individually finance the healthcare, retirement, and living expenses of up to 6 aging adults, draining their disposable income. The state successfully deleted hundreds of millions of future dependents from their ledgers, but in doing so, they also eliminated the very workforce they need to sustain their empire today. We can see exactly where this leads. This chart tracks the United Nations World Population Study projections for China's dependency ratio. By the year 2050, as the current working class retires, that number climbs to 70. For context, 70 is the exact ratio paralyzing Japan right now. It's the threshold where a country's surplus wealth vanishes, consumed by the costs of elder care. After 2050, the trend accelerates. Because the current generation is still largely having only one child, or none at all, the workforce continues to shrink while the retiree population grows. By 2100, the data projects a ratio of 128 dependents for every 100 workers. At that point, there are barely enough active adults to keep the lights on. Cities begin to empty out, innovation stagnates, and the massive pool of capital that funds China's global reach evaporates. A shrinking population creates an internal instability that can bleed into foreign policy. Historically, declining powers that feel their window of opportunity closing have sometimes turned to aggression to secure their interests before their resources run dry. You can see this tension clearly when you compare China to the United States. This split-screen chart illustrates how the American dependency ratio remains relatively flat and healthy, while the Chinese line rises into a crisis. The American line stays flat because of one specific mechanism: a steady influx of working-age immigrants who immediately start paying taxes and filling jobs. China is capable of letting in foreign workers to fill the 30 million factory jobs currently sitting empty, but they won't. The ruling party demands strict cradle-to-grave social control, and they view opening their borders as a threat to their authority and their intense nationalism. The leadership is backed into a corner. They can either preserve their rigid, single-party ideology and watch their nation age into the largest nursing home in history, or they can open their borders, save their economy, and risk losing the total political control they spent a century building.